Greetings from Ithaca, New York, home of Cornell University. I'm Chris Wofford, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Thanks to those of you who have turned up early and answered those polling questions. We'll take a look at those in just a minute, and I have further instructions on QR codes and polling once we get into it. Today's guest is Nellie Brown, a certified industrial hygienist who specializes in training and technical assistance on a wide range of occupational safety and health hazards, including crisis and violence prevention, occupational stress, hazard analysis. We actually first worked together way back in April 2020. Nellie, you and I held a virtual keynote called Workplace Safety in a Pandemic on how to slow the spread of coronavirus. Feels like a lifetime ago. There was so much uncertainty. Plexiglass was going up everywhere. People were scrambling for PPEs. Many people were washing their groceries. There were no vaccines anywhere in sight at that moment. So Nellie Brown, when things are terrible, you turn up. Is this how we're going to work together or what?
I expect so. I mean, my field is occupational safety and health, which means that everything I deal with is nasty. It's the nature of my work. But hopefully, in today's program, we'll look more at the prevention side of things and rather than just the aftermath.
Perfect. Preparedness is what it's all about. Speaking of which, viewers, a couple notes on our programming today. Again, we're going to be asking you to answer polling questions during our discussion, and we'll ask you also to, at the end, rate our performance. So throughout the presentation, you may see a QR code come up, and you can launch the polling by shooting that QR code with your smartphone. No secret there. This event is being recorded and will be viewable at the same URL afterward. So if you have to bail or you want to recommend this to a friend or a colleague, simply share the same URL. That's where you'll view the recording. You may submit your questions for Dr. Nellie Brown in the chat here, which you may open by clicking the dialog box at the top right of your video player. Throughout our discussion, we'll also be sharing URLs and resources in the chat as well, so heads up for those. And if you're watching the archived recording, those links are available in the overview section below. Did I call you doctor?
Yes.
Tell me about your designations after your name, because they're appearing.
I have a Master of Science and I'm a
it.
Certified Industrial Hygienist, which means that I'm certified by the Board for Global Credentialing for Environmental Health and Safety.
Got it.
And so it's certification in the field of occupational safety and health.
Perfect. Good. I needed to clarify that and clean that up a little bit. Okay, let's review our crisis audit, which is what we're calling this audience polling exercise. We've launched some Slido, a poll here, and the question we've asked everyone are, what are the 3 most serious potential crises your organization could experience? Well, we see what's predominating here: natural disasters, theft, financial fraud, understaffed, school shooting. Just kind of a little inside baseball note, we had first come together on putting something together in response to the Uvalde and Buffalo Top shootings, right? And so that was certainly top of mind when you and I started discussing putting together a crisis management keynote. So yeah, any surprises here? Do you see what you typically expect?
Unfortunately, there are not surprises here.
Right.
This is the real trick. I've tended to find in my past work in this area that people tend to be reasonably good at preparing for whatever is the natural disaster for their particular geographic area. Mm-hmm. But the difficulty often is getting people to truly think about the unthinkable and envision far beyond natural disasters.
Sure. And what we've seen there is that there are a wide array of concerns that people have at their workplaces. So this would be interesting to see how we go through the next several questions, which are the follow-up questions to do our little crisis audit analysis. How well prepared is your organization to manage the crises you have just listed above? So here's where we'll learn a little bit about people's feelings about their own organizational preparedness in response to the very things that we just looked at. I think I have an idea how this may go down. It'll either be somewhat prepared or not prepared at all, but people seem to think that they're relatively well prepared. I don't know. Is that what you see in your daily work?
Well, what we've tended to see in the published literature is that companies and organizations generally tend to be better prepared for those crises they've faced in the past or ones that are very typical for their type of organization.
Got it, right.
But they tend not to push the envelope on other areas, which unfortunately means that those are the crises that will happen because you are not prepared for them. You never thought you were vulnerable in those other areas, and so those are the things that bite you.
Well, there we go. So somewhat prepared, up at 58%, a solid 15 not prepared at all, which is concerning. Let's go to the next question here, which is how would your organization manage if more than one of the above crises happened at the same time? Things may look a little more dire after this one. So we would certainly struggle, if not fail altogether, right? We may find a way to get by, or we would succeed in meeting the challenge. That'll be a surprise. So yeah, we may find a way to get by, and typically organizations do to some degree.
Yep, they try to manage. A lot of times, though, what happens is there are differences in how long that organization going forward stays in business, or what their actual profits and return on investment turn out to be. It's not easy to manage two crises simultaneously. So the idea of even envisioning that can happen, and Murphy's Law is like that. Things will go wrong at the worst possible time.
Speaking of the worst possible time, so let's kick it up one notch further, which is how would your organization cope if one or more of these crises occurred at the same time as a natural disaster, which seems to be happening in our country and honestly, certainly globally at any given moment, right? So we'll see how people respond here. Certain failure, possible if not probable success. We could handle that and may even succeed in meeting the challenge. So we see things kind of shaken out as possible, if not improbable success. Again, seems like a rather sunny way to kind of look at things. I wouldn't characterize it as naive, but we'll see what kind of comes out here. That's where we're landing, possible, if not improbable success. Is that the response you typically get?
Well, I tend to find that it depends on what the natural disaster is. When you think about an organization facing a really, really nasty, say, storm event, like people are facing now in Florida, well, go back and envision Hurricane Harvey in Texas, where we had a chemical plant, I'll leave it nameless for the moment, but a chemical plant which manufactured very reactive chemicals in the organic peroxide family, and they envisioned that if there were a major storm event, they could keep their chemicals refrigerated and they would be fine and they'd be stable, except that the storm event exceeded even their original projections of the worst event, and they still lost their backup power also, and the plant exploded. And the reality was that a mile and a half distance away from the facility, people had to be evacuated. So sometimes when you think about this and you believe you've done all the right things, it still may not always work out well.
That's right. Just plan for the worst, the most disastrous scenario.
Yes.
So I want to break from our script a little bit and ask you about the work that you do, just to kind of set the table here. You have a really unique, interesting job at Cornell and the work that you do in New York State and sometimes beyond. Tell us a little bit about the work you do to provide some context to our audience.
I provide both training and technical assistance in occupational safety and health. So I deal with a very wide range of potential workplace hazards. It could be anything from people working with chemicals, people dealing with biological agents, including, of course, diseases, as we've discussed already, ergonomics, crisis and violence as well. A lot of times indoor air quality, workplaces that think they're very clean and pristine, like schools and offices and banks. So when I think about what it is that I'm doing, a lot of times I'm helping people meet regulations, but for so many workplace hazards, there are not regulation. So you're looking at what would be the best practice for your organization. If you want to, for example, increase your profits, not spend so much money on health and safety, well, there are ways to do that. Health and safety can, in fact, be a profit center. You can use it for marketing purposes. You have an organization that's very safe. People want to employ your organization. They want to do business with you. So there are ways to manipulate that as well. And of course, I'm most interested in protecting people, but also protecting the environment and where possible, making things as green and energy conserving as I can as well. So a lot of times I'm doing programming that is an overlap of many different areas, and sometimes I'm looking at health and safety from a more unique point of view. For example, I'll look at occupational health and safety through the lens of gender, or look at the aging workforce. And so I try to give people an idea of, these different lenses that we often need to approach health and safety, simply because this is the setting in which we're doing this work. And so it's important to be able to make a particular sort of hazard, adapt that to whatever the setting happens to be.
So backing up for those among us who are in organizations that don't have an elaborate disaster crisis management plan, why do it? I hate to kind of kick into the obvious, but your answer is actually quite interesting to me in our conversations.
Yes, why bother? Why spend
bother?
the time on
We
it?
can fix it after it happens.
Yes, or people will say to me, even in my workshops, well, we'll think on our feet. And, oh yeah, when you're stressed, we're not creative.
Right.
There are reasons why in situations we celebrate people who are heroes, because they're able to, keep their cool when everyone else is not.
Yeah.
But to me, the issue is a matter of preserving life, protecting the environment, and also if an organization wants to stay in business, they want to maximize their profits, they want to do well as a business, then they really need to envision how things can go wrong so that they can look at how to head those off. My goal is to help people make what could be a potential crisis into a non-event. That's the real issue here. And if we can do that, it's amazing when you look back on it and you think, oh my goodness, we headed that off, we're going to do okay. As opposed to, all right, the worst happened and now we're in recovery mode and it's going to be a while.
Which is costly. So let's go back to
Yes.
making the business case. How do you do that? How do you talk about making a business case for crisis management preparedness?
Well, it depends really on what sort of crises an organization is likely to face, where you can basically say to them, look, there's good information of organizations in the U.S. where they have done a very good job of planning, and the result was that they stayed in business longer. They experienced literally a third less crises than organizations that were less prepared because they headed off so many early on. Their return on investment was much, much better, often twice as much in some of the studies. So I think it's important for people to realize that anything you can do in pre-planning, you don't have to do thinking on your feet. And especially if whatever the crisis is, it's the experience of it to your workforce, to the neighborhood, to the environment, could be quite nasty, and you would want to be able to say, yes, we acted in a responsible manner to protect people as best as we could.
So if the reasons are so clear, why are people resistant to prepare for crises?
I tend to find that there are a couple of reasons that seem to jump out the most. One is that people don't want to spend the time. They don't want to get people together and work through this stuff. And I think the other is that we have a natural reluctance as humans to think about the unthinkable. We don't want to really believe that this could really happen here, that people could be injured or killed, or that our business will be out of business for a while, recovering, or our reputation will be ruined in trying to recapture it. It's going to be quite a long struggle uphill.
So what is it about crises that make them so unmanageable? Why aren't organizations nimble enough and able to pivot and deal with things?
Well, when you call something a crisis, what you're really saying is that it's nasty, it's bad, whatever it is that happens, it's bad. It seems to unfold with a steadily increasing escalation. So it very quickly takes on the view of being out of control. And then you're under a tremendous amount of scrutiny. You're going to be scrutinized by your own workforce, watching how management is dealing with this, but you're also going to be scrutinized probably by your stakeholders, and worst of all, of course, you're going to be scrutinized by the media. So that as a result, an organization can feel like it's really now under siege. And the pressure really mounts on how people are really now recovering and responding to it. And so it's just this steady escalation, this out of control kind of situation with people feeling enormous pressure that makes this the crisis that it is. Otherwise, you would just handle it and move on. So when we say something is a crisis, we're really talking about, did we have the resources, the planning, did we really manage this and head it off early on, or does it completely overwhelm us?
Why are there obstacles, or maybe you can kind of describe the way they are the way they look. Why do people have so much difficulty in imagining or kind of understanding their own vulnerabilities and imagining the breadth of crises or disasters that could strike them? Is it just that people don't have the training, obviously, to kind of deal with this,
I think
what?
some of it is having some good tools, because those prod you to think beyond what you might ordinarily have done and to push the envelope. I think a lot of times organizations fall into a very common trap, which is to envision only those kinds of crises that they've either faced in the past or that are typical of their kind of business. Now, I'll give you one example of that. I was doing a public program, and attending the program were some very high up, really vice presidents of a major banking firm from across the country. And so as we're looking at, vulnerabilities, I remarked to them, well, I imagine, being in banking, that your big worry is robbery. And they said, oh, no, we have so many branches across the U.S. We experience on average 3 robberies a day. So we don't think of robbery as a crisis. And I said, well, if you're a teller in one of your banks and you're the person facing the gun and the note from the robber, would you think that person would view it as a crisis? I mean, so oftentimes people forget that when you're looking at this, it's not just your broad organizational view, it's how will your people experience a crisis. That's why you have to really look at this from several different points of view.
So you're suggesting that the training, right, qualifying people, actually needs to go from top to bottom, right?
Yes.
Everybody needs preparedness training?
Yes. Everybody needs to at least participate in the actual envisioning process, because different people's points of view are going to give you ideas about vulnerabilities that you might never have thought about. And a lot of times you have to realize that unless you invite people from different levels of your organization to be open about vulnerability, bad news often doesn't travel upwards in organizations because people don't want it to. They don't want to be the one to be the messenger getting blamed for something, and so they don't. And so you think to yourself, wow, if we'd only heard from, say our first line supervisor, whatever, about a particular problem, we could have headed that off. But no one wanted to be the one to say it, so they never did, and the information does not travel vertically.
Earlier in some of our discussions, you had explained that having a diversity, a plurality of voices and experience in crisis management, the right people in the room to start doing crisis management preparedness, how important it is. What does that really look like? How does it play out in practice? How do you set up a super team?
In practice, you want as many different points of view as you can possibly get. So you not only want people from upper management, you want first frontline workers. You want people from all your various departments. And that includes not forgetting your security, your legal department, your finance or marketing departments, your manufacturing, and both operations and maintenance sides of things. People's views, the more diverse they are, they not only have a good sense of vulnerabilities that you might not have thought about, but also they spark each other. And I find that's true not just when I do training on crisis management, but also when I go into facilities and do training on process failure analysis as well, is there's nothing like a diversity of view points in the room to enable people to really produce good work product, to really look at vulnerabilities and to really then envision recovering from some of those problems. What would that then look like?
So what are the aspects of our organization that we do need to look at, right? So let's say there's a supply chain issue, right? We're not going to be able to sell as many of our products. We're going to struggle economically. Or there's a pandemic. Half of our workforce is going to be returned home, or the entirety of it. Or there's a mass shooting. How do you kind of, prepare for the breadth of those kind of things? I mean, you've got a crisis plan. Let's say you have a crisis plan for each of those. Then what do you do?
Well, I like to have people take a look at that particular category and envision how stories in that area will unfold, and then to think about how they want to plan for good recovery. Do they want to plan for what of those scenarios would be the most likely to occur, or would they prefer instead to look at planning for that story which, if it did happen, would be the worst and the most severe, because those are very different. They're often very different kinds of stories. And I say to people, okay, to do recovery planning, what you need to do is you need to envision that story has happened. What does it look like now? What does your organization look like now that that's happened? Now, if you think about that, what would you want to have to get back up and running? Because it's often more difficult, I find, to get people to envision crisis and recovery planning going forward in time. It's often easier to do it going in a reflective, going backwards in time. In other words, because hindsight's so much better.
Sure.
And the idea that if you envision that it's happened, what does that then look like? What does your organization experience? Are people dead? Are they injured? Has the environment been contaminated? What's happened in the neighborhood? Or if it's your stakeholders are not getting critical services, what does recovery? You can start thinking about, all right, then what are the items that we need to do to recover, both in the short term for essential services, but also in the long term to get truly back up and everything running. And based upon those, what are the things we could do now that we could pre-do? Everything from redundancies in critical equipment or critical suppliers or whatever, through to missing training, gaps in training that people could use. But also taking a look at how you're then going to care for those people in the aftermath, whatever that crisis might have been.
That's really good advice, reverse engineering it.
Yes.
Yeah. You know what else? It kind of helps everyone, I presume, kind of project or at least to understand how that particular crisis would affect them personally in the performance of their work, or just, just how would it affect them individually. You probably get a lot of people having pretty clear vision about what they need to do individually.
Yes, and it's one thing to do your planning for your organization, but you also have to make sure that individuals know that if this crisis were to happen, what do you expect of those people? You don't want them in a crisis to have to go to your manual and figure out in there what is their role. They really need to have something very simple, even if it's a one-pager, that if this is what happens, this is what we want you to do. It may be as simple as, we gave you a flashlight, get yourself out, and we'll meet at this other location. Or it could be that you're asking people to basically come together and meet on what our strategy is now going to be, or what our alternative lines of communication are going to be, or whatever. So you have to make sure people know that. When you think about serious disasters, a lot of times people have only thought part way. I mean, my favorites are things like in the Twin Towers for September 11th, people had backup servers right next to their primary servers in exactly the same building, so they lost everything. Okay, that's not really thinking this through. I had, for example, a school district I was doing some training for a few years ago, and they thought they had planned for power outages with bad weather events, except that the backup generator for one of their major buildings was in a sub-basement. And the sump pump for the sub-basement was not plugged into the generator. So they lost their backup power as well.
Yeah.
So people often are not really thinking through their plans. They think they've got everything taken care of, and yet they have not really envisioned, okay, this has gone wrong. Now what does this mean for us? And oftentimes carrying through the story to completion, envision this has really gone wrong. What does this mean?
Perfect. I want to pivot a little bit and go to some audience questions because they're coming in, and I think there's some really, really good ones here. Speaking of hindsight is 2020, Nancy asks, how should we have prepared for understaffing in healthcare before COVID? Thoughts on this?
Wow. Understaffing in healthcare is not a new problem.
No.
Nursing shortage, for example, alone is a longstanding problem, and healthcare in general has been an aging workforce in the U.S. So this was bad, in essence, bad planning from a long time ago. So how could we have done a better job of that? Well, we could have built, as healthcare organizations, better partnerships with local colleges and universities to make sure that you are indeed putting people through healthcare tracks and you have replacement workforce, in the pipeline. These are the kinds of things that, when the crisis hits, they immediately point to you where your weaknesses were.
Yes.
And that's why I say to people, this is why the pre-planning is so important, because if what you're doing is only discovering your problem in its entirety when a crisis hits, that's what makes it a crisis, okay?
Yeah.
That's the essence of the problem.
What we've been doing here is kind of making the case, right? I mean, ultimately what I want our audience to do is to go out and take action. And we've got some action items coming up. There's a couple links that I want to share. I just want to take a quick pause before we take some more audience questions. Just while I'm thinking about it right now, you work at Buffalo CoLab, which is a Cornell University center or an institute located in Buffalo. You can receive, or rather access a bunch of resources through their website. I'm going to share this one, the Workplace Health and Safety Education and Training at Buffalo CoLab. We'll also share Buffalo CoLab's URL as well. They do beautiful work, fantastic work, and we have several guests rolling through the studio in the coming weeks. If you want to go so far as to contact Nellie for a consultation or just more questions, follow up, find out what your organization can do for crisis management, we'll include your email address. Thank you for offering that up. And we'll have a couple more shortly. So this is a good question here. I like this one. This is from a question from an anonymous viewer. How important is it to assess recovery plans and decisions that were taken in time of crisis? And should assessment be done internally or by an external partner or party? So let's think about assessment of COVID response. Are people doing this? What's going on? You read these frightening clickbaity articles about we're not prepared for the next one. What's your experience?
Well, I always think back to 2009 with an influenza pandemic that we had, and I was trying to get people then to do pandemic planning. And I got all these interesting comments back from people saying, we don't need to do that. America has a great healthcare system. We have great scientists. We'll have vaccines. We'll just deal with it. We'll be fine.
Yeah.
And I trying to say to people, but when you have a bad illness, you're going to have people sick. You're going to have maybe critical people who are out. People might be home caregiving. You can't depend on everybody being at their best when a major illness strikes. And so I try to get people to think about when you come through a crisis, you need to reflect on how things went. Not doing any scapegoating. This is not the time for that. It's time to celebrate who did well, who performed well, who did great work, and also at the same time, what people did not do well, and how could we help them do better? So that we don't put a lot of blame around. What we do is we learn from this, and we build in capacity to do better next time. And hopefully to head off those things in the future. And I think we've learned a lot with the current pandemic that people are not necessarily at their best. A lot of people are working very long hours to make up for short staffing. people are getting burned out, or the equivalent of that. They feel like they are
Yeah.
in some way. And when you think about what this means, you also have to realize there's a lot about the current pandemic that, in many ways, to me, looked back to my doing training on HIV/AIDS when it first appeared, where you were dealing with a disease where the information coming out was always on the cutting edge. You were
Yes.
always looking at literature every day. I was, I'd be updating my PowerPoint 3 or 4 times a day on SARS-CoV-2. I mean, it was just like what I was doing with HIV.
Yeah.
That you had people working in healthcare, putting in very long hours, but often not getting success stories. The problem with HIV when it was early on was it had such an incredibly high fatality rate. You're talking about 96, 97% fatality rate before we had treatment for it. That people working in healthcare didn't have the success stories that you would have for other conditions, where you could celebrate the people you've ushered through a disease and they're recovering, and you can see them get out of the building. You watch them leave. But and so here we are with SARS-CoV-2, where you have an awful lot of people, caring for patients that are not doing well, and that because of the need to isolate them, they can't see their family members except on an iPad or a phone, and so they are themselves very isolated, and the healthcare workers find themselves doing more of the nurturing and care of people at their end of life. And so this has been a very grueling experience for a lot of people. And then you're dealing with a lot of workplaces where the workforce is having to come to work. They're essential workers. There's no other way to do their job except to show up. And then to have them be given less than adequate protective equipment and protection. So this has been a very, very stiff learning experience. And I'm hoping that people will have learned a lot from that. I think we've already begun to learn that for some workplaces you can build in flexibility electronically in ways we never would have thought was possible. But we still have a lot of jobs that by their very nature are done in person. And we have to adequately protect those people that are on, in essence, the front lines, regardless of what type of job they do.
Perfect. Other lessons learned, or rather, kind of situating yourself to be truly preventative and prepared. You had discussed a crisis manual. What is a crisis manual? What does it look like? I know documentation is really important, but how does that take structure and shape when you're advising organizations on putting it together?
Well, when you get your team together with all of its diverse points of view and you run through some real intense exercises to push the envelope on your vulnerabilities, then your crisis manual can begin to evolve. You start looking at different categories of crisis and envisioning what your recovery plans would look like. And when you do that, you want to envision not just what it would take to recover and build in the necessary redundancies and care of your workforce and your stakeholders, but you also want to build in good communication tools. When people are dealing with a crisis, they have to be able to communicate, even if it's exclusively internally, but they may very well have to communicate with their stakeholders, or they may have to deal with the media. And so you want to be able to have prepared set phrases and terms and expressions and so forth, so that you don't have to develop absolutely everything from scratch. And of course, the statements you're going to make and the kind of information you're going to impart is going to vary with the type of crisis that you're experiencing. But we recognize that the crisis is not necessarily going to unfold exactly the way you envision, but it'll be close enough that you won't have to start totally from scratch with everything. So your manual will have a lot of communication pieces as well. And so what you'll end up with are, in your plan, are ways that your organization is going to recover, what sorts of things will get you back up and running, what sort of things will be early warning signs that maybe you can head off those crises. And so you want to be cognizant of those, and how can you build in warnings through your organization. And you also want to remember that part of your planning process is how you will care for the people. And depending upon that crisis, it could be anything. If it's a natural disaster and you've got people working 24/7 in your facility because they can't leave, then how are they going to get fed? Where are they going to sleep? How are you going to take care of it? Okay, if it's a situation where you have people who witnessed something horrific, how are you going to build in critical incident stress responses for them? How are you going to care for them psychologically so that they will recover? People experience emotional wounds, and you have to recognize that those are real, and people need to be given the opportunity to work through that and be given whatever support they need to address that.
I want to synthesize a couple questions. An audience question, viewer asks, how often do you find organizations are not doing a good job with forecasting risk management, having good proactive processes in place? My notes here told me that I should bring up signal detection, right? So what does that really mean? I was trying to think of an example. Let's say, how would one prevent a mass shooting by an employee who has been visibly threatening for weeks? How do you deal with something like that?
Yes, that is one of my examples I was giving earlier about information not moving up the organization.
Right.
If you have so many media reports where someone has gone into a workplace and they were, say, a former employee, and that person felt that they'd been treated unfairly and they'd been complaining and they'd done all kinds of different stuff, but that information just never moved up through the organization. So as a result, this person feels that they're justified in taking whatever action will rectify the problem for them. That's the kind of stuff that we think of as signal detection. Do you have a workforce that's willing to talk about someone that they recognize is struggling in their workforce, someone they know the behavior is so different from the way they used to be? So there's something else going on here. Get this person some help, okay? Or when you think about situations where someone believes that the way that some of the financial record keeping is going is not making sense. Okay, are they willing to report that so that people can do the proper internal auditing and catch it before it's caught externally? And similarly, you often need to make sure that your signal detection is something that is as early as possible for the beginnings of a problem. A lot of times we can't do a good job of that because it's just not possible. But whenever we can build in anything in the organization that encourages a good flow of communication upwards from anyone who observes something or thinks something needs to be fixed. They're seeing a quality issue in a product, or they're seeing information being fudged, or something that doesn't make sense to them.
Yeah. That
they're willing to share that and say, look, it doesn't look right to me. Maybe it's just me, but there's something here that isn't right, and be willing to say something about it.
Perfect. A couple great audience questions coming in. This is kind of talking about the optics of crisis management. Ashley asks, as an organization, how do you handle the communication around the fact that you have not planned for that specific crisis? How do you deal?
Wow. Well, I find that there are some communications phrases that you can use to be able to express that omission. But you have to be willing to say that you made a mistake, and here's how we're going to fix it and move forward. What you do not want to do is sweep it under the rug, because if it comes out later that you knew about it and you did nothing, the repercussions for reputation and for an organization's, often its survival, are far worse. You're much better off saying, okay, we thought we'd done a good job, we planned for all this different stuff, we've done so much effort in areas around crises. It just never occurred to us that this would ever happen this way. We accept responsibility for that. Here's how we're going to move forward. Or if you have a problem that had widespread repercussions, you've got to be willing to address those. Basically accept the responsibility and show how you're going to fix it. It's much better to be proactive like that than to try to conceal it. Concealing it just seems to come back and bite people so much worse later.
Right, because no amount of finessed recovery can kind of get over that concealment thing, right?
Yeah.
Cover-up's worse than the crime sometimes. Nikki chimes in and asks, how do organizations handle more complex ongoing crisis management surrounding like social justice issues, for instance? This presumably has come up maybe in recent years in your work, preparing for, all-encompassing social upheaval. Like, I don't know, we're talking about a couple of years ago, but it feels like it's been going on for years. Any thoughts on this?
Well, I'm trying to figure out what exactly is being asked here. So, in other words, an organization is finding itself having to address a history of a racist history or something like
Right.
something like that.
Right.
Okay. Well, again, I think the important thing is to acknowledge the history. Okay. The thing that I get very concerned about this idea of woke culture and then insulting woke culture, the reality is, if this is what happened in the past, acknowledge it and look forward at how you're going to fix it. Okay, what can you do about it? Instead of wallowing in the guilt and everything, we have to face the fact that our ancestors did whatever. Okay, they did it, fine. It's us now. We have to look at what are the repercussions then? What are we dealing with now that we can fix? What are things that are indeed fixable? And so this is what I think is the important thing, is again, it's acknowledging the problem and moving forward with the constructive solutions. And, this is our history. We all come from somewhere, and this is the reality. So we need to just be willing to acknowledge that, but move on constructively and not just get so hung up on the past that we can't, we're frozen. We've got to look at how we can move forward. And my view is you find out from those people that are at a disadvantage what would be the most useful for them. What are the things that you could tackle that would make the most difference? And if there's any that's easy, go after the low-hanging fruit first and fix those things that are simple and easy first, and then begin to work through the tougher ones.
Right, and that requires a workplace that has a culture of we are all works in progress. The work will never be done, right?
Yes, in essence, yes.
Constant dialogue.
There's always improvement.
We've always got work to do. Yeah, exactly. Damage containment. What's that all about? You had mentioned that it's virtually impossible to kind of deal with in the moment. What is damage containment? Let's just talk about it.
Wow. Well, depending on what the crisis is, damage containment may be that people are killed or injured. There's been a release to the environment and the neighborhood's been affected, or local water or soil's been contaminated, or it's affected stakeholders in a very severe way. And the problem is that is something that you really have to envision and do pre-planning for. You cannot really do this damage containment in the moment. I mean, trying to save life while a shooting is unfolding, wow, you had to have worked out the protection, the security, all that stuff ahead of time. Doing all that in the heat of the moment is really very difficult to do. And that's why I say I take people through that a lot of times with process failure analysis, similar way. Do you have any way to say that your process has impending failure? That you have warning signs? Do you have equipment that measures that? Do you have sensors? What have you got that gives you some idea that something is unfolding so that you can, in fact, take action quickly? Because once the damage begins to hit, it's too late.
One crisis that kind of comes to mind, and you and I have talked about this a couple months ago, but Uvalde, Texas is a perfect example, right? Their position on their particular preparedness, well, we hired all these officers, we kind of, militarized the local police to deal with this kind of thing, but in the end, there were several hundred people, law enforcement officers, security personnel, who were kind of unprepared to deal with with the very situation that they were supposed to be prepared for. So there must have been a follow-through training. Maybe their manual wasn't so tight. I can't say, and I don't mean to joke around about it, but you know what I mean.
Well, a lot of the times for these kinds of situations, you're best off running scenarios
Yeah.
and drills. You're best off trying those. And I've developed them in some of my trainings. I have, especially if it's an all-day program on crisis management, I will run a concurrent scenario and have it unfold through the day so that people get a chance to practice some of the things that we're looking at as crisis techniques. And so I tend to get people thinking very seriously about this, all the way to the point of bringing a colleague in to help the class work through a press conference. I mean, try everything, practice these things, because it seems, as looking back, for example, of the Uvalde situation, that people knew how to do this stuff, but they sat outside and didn't do it. They delayed, and that delay cost a lot of lives. Yes, it is tough to do this, but the reality is that you learn these things in a light, sort of almost humorous framework with a lot of light training, and then you do a drill under pressure. Those two emotional scenarios let the brain store this information in many different places and attach it with many different signals, so that as a result, when a situation does unfold, you're more likely to have that training come up to the fore, and you move forward and you do what you need to do. And that's what I've tried to get people to look at, how the brain processes information, that, when you're first learning something, it's fun to do it with a little humor and a light touch.
Yep.
And then when you practice it, that's when you do the drill under some negative emotion, some pressure, so that then people experience both sides of it. They got a chance to learn the theory, and then they get to do the practice.
Right, and they've had that shared experience as coworkers
Yes.
who would, ultimately be involved in managing that crisis in real time, and all that preparedness must help. Danielle asks, the pushback I get is, it'll never happen here, so I can't get buy-in. What do you advise I say? So I want to add a little bit onto this, which is, we can't prepare for every situation. So, what do you say when Danielle, to her question?
Well,
You hear this
yes,
every
I hear
day
this.
of your life.
I hear this in my crisis trainings, and I like to give as an example of that. Dealing with, some years ago, I train all over New York State, so I was dealing with a county, and I was going through crisis management and getting them to envision different families of vulnerability of crisis, different aspects of things that can go wrong. And they said to me, look, we're a public sector entity. We're not going to face any kind of financial or economic crisis because we have a dedicated line in the budget. It's never going to be a problem for us. I said, well, you're worried about privatization. Are you worried about, a major disaster, a major regulatory, you have big fines? No, we're not worried about it. We have plenty. Money is not an issue. Okay. So a year later, they invite me to come back, and they want to do some more recovery planning. And I says, okay, what sort of crises families did you want to try doing plans for this time that you want us to work through with me facilitating? They said, well, one of them we want to do is the economic financial category. I says, wait a minute. A year ago, you told me this was not something that would ever happen here. And they said, well, in the last year, our county went through receivership, and we would have suppliers refusing to sell us anything because they'd seen that in the news, and they were afraid if they sold us anything, they wouldn't get paid. Sure. And we tried to say to them, no, our department has a dedicated, fund, dedicated tax line. You don't have to worry about that. We weren't believed. Okay, we had, the county had a bunch of layoffs, and so the employees were moved from various departments to our department based on seniority. All right, people did not want to do the jobs in our department. They didn't like them, so they would call in sick, they would take all the time, vacation, anything they could take off, they took. And we couldn't get crews mounted to provide services to the county. So people would see our trucks on the street doing, say, a repair, and citizens would walk up and they would yell at our employees about how, well, you weren't coming, you haven't been here for days, it took you long enough to get here. These people would get phone calls at their offices, people screaming and swearing at them that services were not being provided appropriately. And then, to top it all off, the purchasing department was down to like a couple of people. And so this department would send a sort of undercover employee to put their purchasing requests in top of people's inboxes to try to get stuff acted on. They had no idea a financial or economic thing, because they said it can never happen here. Well, of course, if you say it can't happen here, when it does happen, it will be a crisis. That's the kind of thing that is the reason why when I do this kind of training, I try to push people through a wide variety of different families of crises, because it's the one you don't envision, the one you think will never happen here, that is the one that becomes the crisis. The others you've planned for, you'll probably turn them into non-events. It won't be a big deal.
Hey, let's talk about those family of crises. Can you kick up this list here?
Well,
I think this is really useful. I think it'll be useful for people to kind of get their head around.
Well, when I do this, I get people to do the same question that we started with.
Yeah.
Think of 3 different kinds of things. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, when you've thought of those 3 crises, I try to get people to put them into these different families. Sometimes they belong in more than one place. And then, if there are any they have not considered, I try to push the envelope on those. So I want people to look at, yes, criminal acts that include acts of violence or terrorism, economic attacks, loss of proprietary information, and you're seeing all kinds of
Data
hacking,
breach, yep.
ransomware nowadays.
Sure.
Yeah. Industrial disasters, of course, natural disasters. Breaks in equipment, anything that would be critical functioning for you. Legal problems, reputation perception problems, human resource, occupational ones, health issues, of course, like pandemics, and regulatory problems. And so when you look at these various kinds of issues, sometimes the crisis you've envisioned would be one that would fall into more than one category. But a lot of times people will say to me, well, we don't have patents, so we're not worried about proprietary information. I said, can your computer system be hacked? Can you be subject to ransomware? Do you have data that you collect, which other people would love to have? There are things you don't think of as unique to you that you think of as proprietary, because people often not envision that. And of course, loss of reputation is one that it takes a long time sometimes to recover that. And it may be as simple as a media report was actually an error. And so you've got to try to correct that. But sometimes what happens is what I used to always see in the newspaper is that the bad news was on the front page, the retraction was in small print on the last page. It's that kind of thing. Trying to recapture that momentum is very difficult. So I want people to think very broadly, because a lot of times, when you think that it won't be a financial disaster for you, well, if it's a regulatory fine, if it's a legal case, you can spend a lot of money in a lawsuit at the discovery level, even if the case never goes anywhere. It can still be expensive. So you really have to be open to envisioning where you might be vulnerable. And that's where this diversity of team members coming together to envision crises is so important, because those different people will spot some of these vulnerabilities that others might not have seen.
So for our audience members, how do they know when their workplace, or they need workplace safety and education training like the kind that you deliver? Or is the answer everyone needs to do? I mean...
Well, every organization obviously has issues that it needs to address.
Sure.
But I think it's being open enough to look at what does it mean if your organization were to have issues or problems? What is really likely to be the fate of your organization if something goes wrong? And that's where I feel that you have to be open to this, because if you don't build in the resiliency now, thinking on your feet when it happens is so difficult. People are tied in knots, they're under tremendous pressure, and it's really difficult. And also, you have to realize the redundancy that you need might be a redundancy somebody else needs too. I mean, okay, your problem is your primary electrical source is not working, and your backup generator is starting to fail. Everybody else is the same boat. They all need generators too. Where are you going to get your other generator? How do you build in a community of backup that might be helpful? Some workplaces do that. They have professional organizations, and they say, well, we'll bring in capacity from the next county over, or the next state over. People are willing to lend us stuff because we're willing to lend them stuff. And it's that kind of thing.
Perfect. A couple resources to share again in the chat. So heads up, audience, you'll see a couple URLs drop in the chat. Workplace Health and Safety Education and Training at Buffalo CoLab. Let's share that one. That's information about a lot of the work that Nellie does here. We'll share Nellie's email address with further questions. I'm sure this conversation has probably elicited many questions among our audience. Buffalo CoLab. We've also got an e-commons paper on crisis management, which sort of kind of covers generally a lot of the stuff we had kind of spoken about today. So this brings me to one of my favorite segments. You may have seen us do this a time or two in previous shows, where we have a segment called What Did You Bring? This is where myself and a guest share something that either is valuable to us in our work, helps us do better professionally, or something that just basically interests us as human beings. In this case, I'm going to forgo my What'd You Bring slot and just cede the floor to you, Nellie. What did you bring?
I brought my Neo-Celtic harp. It's a modern interpretation of a harp from about 1750. And I'm going to play a piece for you called Glen Haven by Jeannie Jeanette. And I hope you'll like it. It's a modern interpretation of a Scottish style of Celtic music. So I'll give it a go. Perfect.
Have at it. A couple notes for our audience really quickly while Nellie gets set up. I bet you didn't expect music today, but I hope that this is a pleasant surprise. We are going to ask for some feedback from you. I would like some constructive feedback. I value it quite a bit. It helps me do my job a little bit better every day. So I'm going to ask you to answer a couple questions. How did we do? Just a 1 through 5 star rating. And even more importantly, I am interested in what worked for you. What did you learn? Things that you would have rather seen today. Strong points of our conversation. Anything that helps us do better so that next time you spend an hour with us, you get more out of it. So for now, let's go over to Nellie Brown. Thank you for your input, audience. We'll see you at the next keynote. Take us out with Glen Haven.